Hello and welcome to the Feynman Factor. Today our guest is Robin Waters, who's a musician, keyboardist, vocalist, and he's also a producer and, well, a composer as well. Welcome to the show, Robin.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thanks for taking time out of. I hear you're doing more of your own projects these days, so I'm really interested to hear about what you've been up to, what you're looking forward to. And also, I think a while ago you mentioned that you kind of taught yourself how to record, and it was an interesting story. I want to kind of see if you can share parts of that as you tell us about what you've been up to and all of
Mm,
the good stuff. Yeah.
sure. Yeah, well, recording and producing people is a lot of the main thing I do really these days. It's how I make my living. But I did come from a place of making music and songwriting originally. And I think just through recording those songs with other people and learning from them, that's how I got more interested in recording and wanting to do it. But it was also a very early part of how I got, um, I guess, encouraged to spend more time making music. Um, I remember very early on, when people would ask me what I like to do, I'd often make, and I'm talking even when was 10 years old,
Hmm.
I would make more of a distinction about liking songwriting more than performing because I felt a bit uncomfortable in front of people performing, but I did like songwriting and I liked figuring things out by ear
Mm.
um, and kind of responding to those things I'd figured out by changing them and doing them a different way. And very early on, there was a family friend that had a little Atari computer that you could, control MIDI keyboards with, so you could make
Oh,
uh,
yeah.
multi-track MIDI kind of songs, and he'd let me come over and I would just kind of lay down like little ideas track after track. So very early on I was making up songs, not necessarily with words, by using this non-linear editing software. And there was a part of me as I went on and did more music stuff, I just felt like that's how everything should be to me.
Hmm.
I didn't like making things in a linear way or planning it all out beforehand. I liked to be able to make it in chunks and move it around. And even before that stuff, there was word processors, like that was really the first non-linear creativity moment, I think, for people on computers was
Yeah.
with writing. And it seemed so obvious at that time that everything should be like that. Video should be like that, audio should be like that. And I used
Hmm.
to make films in high school, and I was really frustrated that we had these VHS machines, and you'd have to dub. If you wanted to just put one extra shot in the middle of 20 shots that you'd put together, you had to basically re-edit the whole entire movie from that point onwards and dub it from one cassette onto another. And I just knew that that was not going to be the way things were, and I was really frustrated that it couldn't be the way they were
I
right at that moment.
That's very interesting because there's that famous story about how the Rite of Spring,
Yeah.
Stravinsky's Rite of Spring. Some people, well, I was under this impression that it was written from beginning to end,
Ah, okay.
and apparently it wasn't. That he put the introduction in last,
Mm,
and when you talk about especially when you start talking about the VHS and the editing with the video, I wonder how it was when they were working with film,
mm.
is that they could actually, well, they did work very non-linearly.
Yeah, you could actually cut it and stick it all together.
But then we're talking about doing projects in high school to places where there's a whole team of people who are just in charge of working day to day and figuring scenes out and replacing things and
Mm.
um,
And it's true. It's easy to forget, like for me, it, I felt like it was the technology that was the conduit for that because I'd seen it in the word processing, and I just thought that was the conduit by which all of that could happen. But you're right. There's lots of non-linear techniques that people were using for a long time before that. I mean, if you think about, people using cut-up methods for lyrics and things like that as well,
Oh
or
yeah, 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 yeah.
and just generally how much things were edited. Even if it took a lot longer, people presume that just because it was hard to do, nobody did it. But very early on, people were already embracing cutting things together. I know Bruce Swedian, who is most famously Michael Jackson's producer,
Yeah.
cut his teeth on some Chicago Symphony Orchestra recordings, I believe they were.
Yep.
And that was one of his first jobs when he moved to Chicago
Mm.
as an audio engineer. And he couldn't believe how they did 4 takes of this piece,
Yeah.
orchestral piece. And then the conductor went through, and every 4 bars out of the 4 takes he did chose the 4 bars that he liked best, and they cut this entire, however
That's
long it was, piece of music together, which seems like it would ruin it to me. I don't know how you could do that and make it feel right, feel like it flowed properly, but you don't realize how much of that stuff happened. We kind of have these glasses that we use to look at the past where everything's supposedly more natural and more essential. And
yeah. Well, the thing that you say is probably what is that in the 70s?
well, yeah, I guess maybe it would be around then, so it wouldn't be, hugely early
Hmm.
in the history of like recording music. But yeah, I'm not sure the exact era.
I know that in even in classical recreating the masterworks, as they some people refer to them, when they realized that they could do it, they were like, "Whoa,
Mm,
we can really tune the orchestra
mm,
after the fact."
mm,
Um, and I suppose maybe that made orchestras reach higher levels.
mm.
But also maybe it's good when people are listening to know well, what's the reality and what's the construct.
Yeah, well, maybe it's like the kind of progression towards, you think of visual art and people kind of striving for photorealism
Mm-hmm.
in their art, and then at a certain point, once that feels like it's been achieved, to a point where you can't make it any more photorealistic, abstraction starts to happen. I mean, obviously that's not the only factor in abstraction happening, but it's interesting the idea, with music, because there's that in the moment extreme performance skill that's required with something like that. And you're talking about kind of using recording to augment that, people wanting to go beyond what they can even do themselves in that kind of idea of what rhythmic perfection is or pitch perfection is.
Mm.
Um, and then at some point, is it like art? Do you go beyond photorealism, and does the obsession change, the focus change
Yeah,
to
right.
something different from perfection? A perceived perception of performance. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I mean, a, because you produce people's music as well,
Yeah.
and I suppose that's like this big dialogue that the person's like, oh, well, I'm not sure about the form here. I'm not sure about, oh, I didn't like how the pitch or,
Yeah,
you
and
know,
frankly, there's a lot of people now that also just can't necessarily play very well or sing very well.
hmm,
Um, and sometimes that lends itself to the genre, sometimes it doesn't. But there's definitely an increased expectation from people that, no matter what's wrong with what you're doing, it can somehow be fixed after the fact. And it kind of can, but it's not much fun to do. And really, the reason I do this stuff is because it's fun. If I wanted to do something that wasn't fun, I'd probably do something that paid a lot better. Um, but yeah, it's
So how do you like what's your main principle for managing that when you hooking up with someone and you're enjoying working with them and you're enjoying the project, you're enjoying the music, but there's this thing where there's as we are do. We change moods, and one day they come in and they're like, you know what? Like these 5 tracks we've been working on, I love them, but, and you kind of go like, oh man, we gotta get the project done to go to the next thing. So
Yeah.
do you feel like you have to sort of manage people's expectation of the art making, or do you more become a partner in that, and are able to step back?
I guess I just want it to be something that's feels enjoyable to listen to. And by enjoyment, I mean there's an element of ease to it and an element of truth to it, I suppose, when you
Mm-hmm.
listen to it.
Mm.
And so for me, if someone's coming in and they want to make music and, they struggle a lot with some of the technical stuff,
Hmm.
I don't mind that so much necessarily. It's when that's combined with an extremely high resolution kind of obsession with, what do you call it? Like kind of, I suppose, different genres of music and it's hard to explain. I kind of call it like the clothes of music, really. And it's in a world now where we have so much availability in terms of all these different kinds of musics and subgenres, and we can go back through the history of, even separate suburbs in different cities, and see what the kind of tropes, musical kind of styles were there. A lot of what people start focusing on now, they come from a place of being a music fan, and it seems to me like being a music fan often now isn't so much about necessarily understanding the deep musical principles under what's happening, like pitch and rhythm and, idiosyncrasies of the genre in that way. It's more like just having a breadth of knowledge of as many different traditions as possible, to be able to recognize them if you heard them, basically.
Hmm.
So long as you can do that, they feel like that's a kind of depth of knowledge. And so the discussions and the obsessions that end up happening in the studio become a part about, oh, should we add, 1% reggae to this, or should we give it a 2% more CBGB's vibes, or should we perhaps bring in a little bit of late 80s Detroit techno, and it's kind of and they can't actually as musicians execute any of this stuff. So it's this kind of, it's more like collaging or something. It's more like, I suppose, you could compare it to slash fiction now, or fan fiction that happens with,
Hmm.
and it's, it's interesting, in a lot of ways, but the danger is if someone tries to do something that people in these genres that they're trying to add a little bit of have done, and the people that they're referencing can actually play really well and can do things that these people can't, then you get the sound of someone trying to do something and doing a bad job of it.
Yeah. Well, I wonder what that really does or doesn't do for that individual's development. Because, I mean, it's such an incredible learning situation to record yourself
Yeah.
expressing something and to then reflect on it. As in, by reflect, I don't mean like have light candles necessarily around it, but just be able to just sort of listen to it back. And then with those clothes shining behind the window, as it were,
Mm.
it's kind of like the person's like completely forgets that expression, whatever they had to do to work, whatever they did to get there, to pay you, um, doesn't actually feed forward into who they're going to become next year or 5 years from now.
Yeah. Well, I guess I try to do it in a way where it will feed forward. So it's not about, I try to steer people away from just like fixing everything so it doesn't really sound like where they're at in terms
Hmm.
of their skills. I try to simplify what we're trying to do so that at whatever skill level they're at, it feels right. It's kind of like that Kenny Werner effortless mastery thing, like
Yeah, yep.
once it's something that someone else is listening to and it's not you practicing it, you kind of express something that's 10% under what the most difficult thing you could do is, in the
Hmm.
most ideal circumstances. Because fantastic sounding music doesn't have to necessarily be complicated or difficult to execute. So even if you're someone who can play one note and play it as eighth notes, like that can be amazing music. You know what I mean? Like that
Yeah,
could be Steve Reich if there's like 8, 12 people doing that. So there's always something that someone can do at any skill level that's going to be musically honest and beautiful to listen to and can have a conversation with music that they love
yeah.
without having to just kind of try to do something that they physically can't actually execute.
That's so true. I've been listening to a lot of Stella Adler, the acting coach, talking
Mm,
about developing a character,
mm,
and she's really, really quite inspiring in the way that she says it's not, it's not, it's not historic that the actor is asked to bring anything to the role. They'll just are expected to just act.
mm,
But she's saying it doesn't matter what it is. You have to be able to relate to the bone. She calls the play the bones, and you got to learn where the clues are so that you can reconstruct a real flesh and being live thing.
mm,
And it's not necessarily whether you're gonna, learn to, do triple somersaults on stage.
mm.
It's finding out what's in front of you. So I think that really reflects into making music that, and especially the whole process of coming up with an idea, and then at the other end you have this thing called the recording.
Mm.
So how does that? What are you doing with your own music right these days?
Um, well, I haven't been doing a whole. It's funny. I guess that's come up just because maybe when we were talking recently about it, just in the last 3 or 4 weeks, I've been starting to work on some old material of mine, but I really haven't done anything to do with my own music for maybe the last 5 years or so. I was in a band called the Boat People for about 10 years
Yeah.
up until then, and a lot of that was mainly involved with playing and writing music. And then when recording kind of took over as the thing I was interested in, I originally wanted to learn to record because I would sometimes find it frustrating trying to explain to someone with words how the very finer points of how I wanted something to sound. And you can get really fine with recording. Like it's in the same way that kind of orchestras, I suppose, added more and more and more instruments. It's kind of like recording now becomes this score that's so specific that
Hmm.
it can only be played back by itself. It can only be represented by itself. So tiny little things like, the frequencies that you emphasize or take out when you're EQing a sound become like notes, like a melody in the sound or a chord. It's that same feeling,
Wow.
that
Yeah.
the texture of things, or the way you add compression to a sound and it changes the shape of the attack of it, becomes almost like a melodic shape or a dynamic shape of a whole song,
Hmm. Hmm.
and a microcosm. And so that's kind of the stuff I wanted to focus on as a songwriter in a way, was those kind of microscopic elements of the sound.
Yeah.
Um, but as I, amassed the microphones and everything and sat in the studio, I realized that sitting there and doing it by yourself is the most boring thing in the world. And it's not very motivating either. And it comes back to that thing of, wanting to do it for fun. And I started working with other people, and then that, because I'd come from a music background, it's very much about collaboration. So a lot of what I'll do is play, a lot of the instruments that they don't play. So they might come in with a, acoustic guitar and a song or something, and I might help them with the structure of the song, or
Hmm.
maybe some of the words, and then I'll record drums onto it and bass and whatever other sounds. I've just got stuff lying around the studio, and whatever my eye falls on, I'll have a go
Yeah.
at
Right.
playing that. Which is one of the upsides of recording, is you can get away with that a little bit more than you would in a live performance situation,
Hmm.
to build up those layers. Yeah, and you kind of learn the recording stuff, and then you start to get really interested in the psychological side of it and the interactions you have with people, because really you end up when you're talking about songs with people, you end up connecting on a level that you wouldn't really connect in everyday conversation with them, in a way where you just catch up with someone in a bar and it's like, oh, this is what I did over the last 5 days, or oh yeah, this is what I did over the last 2 months. And people can even tend to be more guarded in those situations. But when the whole goal is to try to express something, you interact with people on a level that you wouldn't normally get to do. Now, I don't know how that relates to me in the last couple of weeks or months getting more interested in working on my own music, but I think it's just from seeing the gaps in all the things I've done with everyone else that I would like to explore, I suppose. Things that people haven't really done when they've come in to work with me.
Hmm. So are you playing all the instruments, or are you um, sort of writing parts of it and then going to add other instruments played by other people?
A lot of them are songs that came about if I might have been recording something else for someone, and then I just kind of found myself playing on the end of that track after the music had ended and just kind of fell into another idea and started playing that. So there might be, 4 or 5, maybe 8 minutes of piano improvisation
Yeah.
or guitar or whatever instrument I might have been playing at the time. And then I kind of end up singing over the top of that or speaking. Sometimes I'm less interested in melodies now, and it's that same thing of the resolution going up because I'm listening so closely to other people's voices when they sing.
Hmm.
I almost hear like the way people speak and the emotional rise and fall of the words as these little microtonal melodies now,
Hmm.
but not in the way that we think of melody more structurally and architecturally, more in the way that becoming interested in the way very small changes in pitch and tone change the color of things for you or the way they feel, the emotional feeling of them, I suppose. And I've gotten much better at becoming emotionally blank when I'm listening to how things affect you emotionally, because that's a real danger, I think, for a lot of people. Um, at the moment, music is so, it's really is still the legacy of the romantic kind of era, like music, and maybe it's an intrinsic thing to music, um, is the way it can affect people's emotions so readily. And I was reading this book recently where it was talking about Sigmund Freud disliked listening to music because it made him feel all these emotions and he didn't understand why,
That's so
and felt
interesting.
very manipulated and uncomfortable because of that. And so he would actually avoid listening to music. Um, and on one level, I relate to that. I don't like that feeling in the cinema when the music surges and I can feel myself reacting emotionally. But I know on an intellectual level that it's such a cliche what's happening there.
Yes.
It's something I've heard a million times before, and it frustrates me that it still works on me. If they pace it just right and they put it in the right spot in the movie and whatever's happening on screen happens. But when the music creates feelings in you that are like these strange combinations of feelings that you haven't been aware of before, that might not happen to you regularly, due to things that happen to you in life or ways that you're more often manipulated by society, then I find emotion in music very interesting.
Wow. That's incredible because listening to you talk, I could relate that you were saying in the textures of your own voice.
Mm,
And
mm,
that was lovely. And the other thing is that I wonder, it's just a question, that the type of non-everyday emotions
mm,
that you're referring to actually are the everyday emotions, except that we are sometimes living in a society that has specified what thinking is,
Yeah.
what emotions are, what meanings are, what signs are, and what language is. And it's kind of thanks to the legacy of that Sigmund Freud.
Mm.
And they decided that in order to look at something, they had to look at the elements. And that has been probably the worst gift they could package and
Mm.
give to modern humans, well, Western humans at least.
Mm.
I'm not sure if in Ghana they can separate like that. I'm not sure. I haven't been to Ghana, but I shouldn't assume anything for them, um, or for any other. Maybe for my neighbor doesn't operate on those levels. But I'm just reading this book about another type of psychology where they decided in order to um, find out who needs remediation. Let's say they were working with a child who was autistic.
Yeah.
They couldn't take feeling and thinking and meaning separately and then
Mm.
try to feed it into this person's system or try to fix this person's uh, lagging part of their system separately. So they actually thought, wait a minute, there's actually an interrelation between how we think, how we feel, and also how we act.
Mm.
And it's not actually separated.
Mm.
Um, and the example that they used was that, well, if you want to study water, you take away, you put it into elements and you look at hydrogen and oxygen, and water puts out fire, oxygen promotes fire, and hydrogen is burned up. So
Mm.
actually, by studying the elements in that way, you might gain some insight, but you won't gain insight into how water acts as a tsunami or how
Yeah.
it acts out of your tap.
Yeah.
That is so. I just love the way you express that. Is that what you bring with your ears is not to be emotionally affected, but be almost an observer of what's happening in this person's song.
Mm.
So then you can add the you can add an element that I don't know if I'm right or wrong in thinking this, but you're almost wanting to add an element that completes what's there rather than becomes a slave to what might be there.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, that's definitely the way I would describe that process. And you're absolutely right, is that when, and it's that thing too we were talking about, trying to find the ease and the truth in the song rather than letting people go down this path where they're doing a bad job of emulating someone else. It's when you hear that idea, that impulse that made someone want to expand it into a song, or even maybe come in and have it recorded. But even as a songwriter, I know that feeling of the impulse right at the start of the process.
Mm.
Um, there'll often be that, it's a feeling, not necessarily one that you would call an emotional feeling, but a feeling of some kind, not as opposed to a description of something, a feeling of something. And as you said, I think we are very much taught, how to categorize our feelings and just categorize things generally. That's one of the dangers of language, and that most of our thought rests on using language and rests on using symbols and signifiers of things. And so, like you said, you used the word complete. To me, it's almost like there's a process that happens so that other people can hear the song, not just you. But throughout that process, the most important thing is not to damage or um, kind of destroy that impulse at the start of the song. And that,
Yeah.
and the easy way to damage it or to destroy it is to funnel it into one of these accepted categories of feeling or accepted categories of meaning,
Right.
which are these tropes that have been, um, repeated over and over and over again to reinforce those kind of ways of interacting with each other.
Wow. Yeah. That's something you wouldn't get bored of doing, wouldn't
No,
it?
exactly, exactly. And it's, um, there is a lot to be said for the mass unconscious and what we do together and the ways we agree to have things in common. But I think it's also balanced by, I suppose I think about, um, when they talk about those kind of basic needs, human basic needs, food, shelter, affection, um, and of course, once all that stuff is taken care of, there's the need for self-actualization, I suppose, whatever that means. And for me, what that's about is, um, it's we all mutate physically, randomly, and that creates diversity, and that creates diversity creates a resilience to change. If
Hmm.
there's cataclysmic change, the fact that there's so many different variations means that one of them will be able to lead the others through, what's happening, or survive it. And I feel like there's something bizarrely strong about an individual's urge to self-actualization. And for me, I feel like maybe that's something to do with a need for social mutation, for there to be social diversity, in how we act as a pack, to the point that no matter what kind of pressures are brought upon us by the society or the social contract we're in, we just need to do it, even beyond often our instinct for self-preservation. You hear about people, um, in East Germany or Soviet Russia, the kind of whole soft power thing, people like risking their lives to get hold of a rock and roll record or something like that. Like that kind of thing doesn't really factor into game theory and the idea of people making rational decisions.
Yes.
And why would that be an evolutionarily smart idea for individuals in your pack or your society to take those kind of risks just to do what they want to do? To me, that's a guess as to why it's important, is because it's not healthy for a society to freeze into a certain mode of operating and a certain mode of interacting and for everyone to be exactly the same. And it's so unhealthy that it makes sense that, um, there would evolve this impulse in people to break out of that, no matter how much of a bad idea it was for them as an individual.
To ask that question. Yeah. It's funny you reminded me of this all the bootleg Michael Jackson that was going around in Tehran
Yeah.
around.
And part of it's a grass is greener thing. There's ideas of, exotic democracy, and as we know, there's all kinds of realities of control in every social system. But, part of it too is individuals trying to find that way to self-actualize, and usually our stepping stone to it is to look, at the things that oppose the system that we feel is controlling us.
Yeah.
And once we use those things to get our mind out of the thing we're so familiar with, then we can start to kind of use the tension between those two extremes to find our own voice in amongst all of that.
So, in this process of giving voice and finding voice, do you think you're going to be more actively performing?
For me, I've never really been all that interested in performing. As I said, um, when I started performing in high school, it was only really because I didn't have a way to share music with people
Hmm.
as much, the way people can now, like just put a recording up online, or any laptop or any iPhone, is kind of a recording studio, and you can share your ideas with people. So I'm not sure. I'm not the music that I'm making at the moment, because it's made in a recording studio, I don't think it's very well suited to a live environment. I think, often the kind of experience that works well for people when they're all together and um, they need to be elevated somehow doesn't necessarily lend itself to music you might make when you're sitting alone by yourself in a room. And because a lot of these songs came together from improvisations, um, because I've got the recordings there and I can put visual markers in to tell me when the chords change and things like that, it's very easy to put melodies and words, and other music over the top of those things. But if a band was to play those things live, it'd be quite difficult. Not necessarily because they're, hard chords to play or fast rhythms or fast melodies, but just because they'd just be hard to remember.
Hmm.
They're very drifty. Things don't really change um, at times when you could easily remember them changing. Not that you couldn't do it, but I just wonder what would be the point. I'd probably prefer people just to listen to the recording. But I would like people to listen to it as a group. I'd almost like it to be like a movie or something. I'd like if everyone could come and sit in a room together and turn the lights off and just um, put on 40 minutes of music for them and have them all listen to it together. I don't know how that would change it from someone sitting there by themselves and listening to it with headphones on, but
Well,
that for me that would be the ideal context for the music that I'm making. And I prefer to make the music and then try to think of the context that it should be performed in rather than the other way around.
right. Yeah. So have you, that sounds really beautiful. Have you thought about, or have you collaborated with a filmmaker?
Um, I haven't before. I often like to think about, the conventions that people use to make things in other mediums and how there's not really any reason that those conventions couldn't be used in another medium except that people are just, don't do it that way. I mean, you think about, you know, musicians in a band, they'll play regularly, they'll kind of add songs a bit at a time. And, if you go to see a performance, they'll maybe have a couple of new songs. There'll be some songs, people with music seem to like hearing songs they've heard before again. You tend to have the same personnel in a band, maybe not so much in jazz or classical idioms, but with contemporary music, it tends to be the same band members that you're working with all the time.
Yeah.
But, with maybe movies or theatre, it's the ensemble of actors changes with every project.
Yes.
The material changes. Like with theatre, you'd have maybe like a 2 week season or something of that material with a particular ensemble, and then you'd have maybe 4 months, 6 months of preparing for a completely different set of material.
Yeah. Yeah. So why
And
not with music is the
there's one,
question.
yeah, there's no reason that couldn't be done with contemporary music, but for some reason, um, you know, the way it's funny, people often start doing things because for reasons to do with the market,
Yeah.
and then people that learn their creativity off their heroes emulate the model of sharing that music that their heroes did, not realizing that it's not really a creative choice their heroes are making. It's to do with the time. So you've got the
Like
explosion.
contracts or
Yeah, well, especially with recordings, you think of, at first it was all singles with the explosion of radio, and then it became all about albums because that's how people made more money was from albums. And everything became, even touring and the way, the songs you would play at a show became very much to do with you play a set and you tour to promote the album that people are going to buy, and maybe you even lose money on the tour, but you're selling albums. All these kind of things that kind of dictated what people did at their live shows or the way they released their music, either as a group of songs or separately. They're all more economic decisions or market decisions,
oh,
but
absolutely, yeah.
people tend to take on those traditional ways of doing things as a creative choice. Like a band will make an album because as music lovers, they've listened to albums growing up, and so they think, oh, well, I want to make an album. That's my art form.
Hmm.
But, there's not really any non-accidental reason that that's why the music's presented that way, as kind of 3 to 4 minute songs that are collected together into a 40-minute piece. It's like the 20th century sonata form or something. It's just this kind of strange. It's kind of a strange way to organize it.
So do you feel that with the boat people, it turned into something that was, well, I don't have to do it this way, but we have to. So,
Yeah, I don't know. I certainly started to feel, just with contemporary music generally, as I said, I got interested in music specifically for the songwriting and the improvising part of it.
hmm,
And, a lot of people would play in cover bands, and I wanted to play original music because of that creativity element. But then the reality is the original music you play is the same original music week after week after week. Whereas when I'm collaborating with people,
yeah,
every time someone comes into the studio, I have to learn their song on the spot, add things, where you really are making something new every time someone comes in. And a lot of people that play live can find the studio frustrating because they're like, oh, I just want to play the song and be done with it. I don't want to spend a whole day on a song. Like, that's 8 hours. And I'm like, then I'm thinking, but they play exactly the same song 100, 1,000 times. So
right.
I guess it's different kinds of impatience. Impatience is a great motivational force, just like laziness is. I try to take anything that someone calls, a negative impulse. I try to like figure out how it's actually a motivating force and a reason to do something cool.
Oh, that's fantastic. So what would you do with something like anger?
Well, I feel like any kind of quality that, people talk about things being negative or positive, but they're all just different sides of, there's always negative or positive expressions of those things. Um, and anger, I suppose, can be a frustration thing or an impatience thing.
Hmm. It's
Um,
like a secondary, isn't it? It's like not,
yeah,
it
but
never
it's how you
really.
express it. To me, my response to anger is to walk away from something. And it's probably a good thing because it means I'm walking away from something that's, annoying or like a waste of time, as many things are in the world these days.
I really like what you said before about how if it's not fun, you're not going to do it.
Yeah.
And I think that can be really related to this moment in, I think it's really a famous moment, unfortunate moment in many ways in Richard Feynman's life, where they just dropped a bomb and they thought they were going to drop it on a vacated military station. They didn't realize there were civilians there. They just didn't know.
Mm.
They literally didn't know, or maybe they didn't want to know. I don't know. It was even the moment that the love of his life dies
Mm.
of tuberculosis, and then he just has this sort of wants to wash his hands of everything, and it's
Mm.
like he's recorded as saying, "I wasn't gonna do it unless it was fun."
Mm.
And then, people are like, come and help us solve these problems, bring your genius here right now in academia. And it's like somewhere learning how to draw naked go-go girls not because they were naked, but he thought they were just very interesting.
Mm.
And to learn to draw them was even more interesting.
Yeah.
Um, so,
Well, this for me ties into a few things we've talked about, because it reminds me of the concept of uselessness, and how everything can have a positive or a negative side to it depending on how you express it, and also the idea of finding your own voice by looking for the opposite of what society pressures you to do. So obviously, I feel like these days things are measured a lot in terms of their utility or their usefulness, and so that makes me think about uselessness a lot. And that's kind of one of my favorite things about music is that even though people often, there's, lots of ways that you could say it is useful, um, and people often have to remind people of those ways that it is useful to, get funding to do something or to have it receive some basic respect in a society that is very utility focused. I feel like uselessness is also very important because something about us and our brains and the kind of constant hallucinating that our brains do, trying to find meaning in everything and trying to change things and organize things. I like that there is an outlet for that that doesn't involve digging a whole bunch of stuff up out of the ground or bulldozing, a whole bunch of things and building something or using a whole bunch of resources. I don't like, I'm so glad music's even less an object now, now that it's just kind of sound floating around on computers rather than like dumpsters full of plastic CDs that people are passing around, between each other. Because to me, that feels more in keeping with what music is. It's just vibrations in the air. It's not a solid thing. And I
Yes.
love that about it. And I love that we can occupy our hallucinating, organizing minds with this vibrating air
Hmm.
and pass it back and forth between each other and know things about ourselves and understand things and see things beyond what are around us, beyond the things that are around us by doing that. And that's in a, I don't know, that's like a strange definition of uselessness, but it's a positive one for me.
That's really fantastic because um, it makes me think of how a person gets out of bed and thinks, well, what am I going to do today that's useful?
Mm,
And, what post am I going to put up? And how am I going to make people think? And
yeah.
I'm
People
always,
often think in terms of stories, they want it, everything's a story, even beyond when they die, they're thinking about what's the story that happens next for my legacy or for the world. I want to find out how the story ends. I find stories to be, yeah, I don't know. I feel like music is different from a story, and I like that because everyone's obsessed with stories.
everyone's obsessed with this kind of, where the arch is and how
Exactly.
is it going to get resolved? And this incredible thing that I'm learning from listening to Stella Adler is she's saying, well, in Ibsen's plays, you have to listen to the wrong and the right, and the male and the female, and the open and the closed, and the caged and the free. And the real play is in the lobby where people start fighting.
Mm,
And the playwright knows that there is no real answer, but it's just so that people listen to something, that people were able to calm themselves down and consider without jumping to some conclusion or consider something uh, that was presented, but make their own mind about it or decide not to make their own mind about it. Where I think it, like that's, well, yesterday I was getting bombarded on just checking Facebook and getting bombarded by all these people who wanted to sell me videos on how to make a video.
hmm.
And I was getting like block, spam, get rid of, die, go away. Nothing personal. Everyone's got to make a buck.
Yeah.
But
And I like with your description of, that description of theatre because I am a bit suspicious at the moment of, um, I guess art that uses words to try to define things so much. It's almost like in the definition you were talking about, it doesn't really even matter what those individual nodes of meaning are, those symbols, female, male, all those different things, but it's the fact that they're set up in tension to each other. And
yeah.
it's similar to music in that way. in that it's an architectural approach or a sculptural approach. You're trying to create all these things that are in kind of weighted to either pull on each other or push against each other so that they become this one structure that people see all at once. And like you said, it's like if they were resolved, that would be the structure collapsing, you know?
Mm, mm. Yes. I think we should become co-authors of a marriage counseling TV show.
A non-verbal marriage counseling. But yeah, it's true.
Um, so, um, as far as what you're doing that's meaningless at the moment or meaningful at the moment, or however you might or might not be categorizing, what is something that you're wanting to, well, prompt us about or tell us about without any kind of sort of selling kind of
Um,
notion?
look, yeah, well, if people want to do stuff with me, probably the best way is through, contacting me through my studio. Um, my email address is robinwaterstheperson@gmail.com, and they can get in touch. I'm not really ready to. I'm not putting anything out soon. I do play in a few different bands with people. I play with an artist called Dan Parsons and in a band called Machine Translations.
Hmm.
Sometimes with Ella Hooper. Um, but yeah, really, what I'm focused on doing at the moment, I suppose, is one of the things I do is I play in this band called the Hacketts through Footscray Community Arts Centre.
Yes, that's lovely. I saw prompts for that on the media, and I was like, Jonathan, look, this is amazing. They're working with people who are expressing themselves, maybe one of the only ways that they can express themselves fully.
Yeah, yeah. Or well, it depends on the person, I suppose. It's more about basically everyone having the same access to music, I suppose, even if there's like barriers that society
Hmm.
unintentionally has up to people learning music, even if it's expectations about what they're capable of, or something as simple as not having the mobility to go to lots of gigs and then meet people and end up playing in bands with them or whatever. But I guess what that was leading me to is through playing in that program and hearing a lot more voices that are different to my own, and that being something that people are talking a lot about, I think, at the moment is, if there's enough of a diversity of voices, I find myself like a lot of my songwriting inspiration used to be about, communicating personal feelings because then maybe someone else had the same personal feeling and they could relate and there was something universal in that. But I feel like my personal experiences are probably overrepresented as a white dude, really. So, yeah, I think whatever I'm doing next, I'm just trying to figure out how to do something that's not really got anything to do with that. Um, and not by representing other people's viewpoints because I'd rather just see them have more space to do that themselves. But um, I think it's that thing, the non-verbal thing and the universal things. We all look at the same moon and everything like that, but there's plenty of moon in June lyrics. So some kind of mass unconscious thing.
Right.
Mm.
Well, thank you so much for taking your time to make this happen. And
I enjoy
yeah,
these conversations. They're always happening with whoever I'm doing stuff with, whether it's being recorded or not. So,
well, it's my luck to have a recording, and I'll be hopefully maybe we'll do this again in a year
mm.
and reflect on it. Who knows?
Yeah, well, I might
Or
actually
just
have some of my own work out by then.
oh well, there's definitely plenty of your conscious beauty and just this I've well just a little bit of history, but I've known you for probably 20 years.
Mm.
I don't know you super well, but I've always admired how you um, express and carry yourself in the most, I don't know, non sort of, there's nothing, there's nothing extra about Robin Waters, the person, that I might need to see. It's Robin Waters, the person, and that's very special, and it's great to have you as part of the music community.
Oh, thank you. That means a lot to hear that. It's like you said, we wouldn't have those conversations really a lot. Normally, we might play together, but yeah, it's funny. It's funny how those kind of conversations come up when you really get into music stuff with each other.
Yes. All right. Well, on that musical note, thanks so much for being on the Feynman Factor, and all the best in your endeavors. Thanks,
Thank you.
Robin.
I'll see you soon.
See you.
Bye.